Good evening, everybody, and welcome to ACT's Change Your Future National Campaign for Election 2020. My name's Simon Court. I'm the ACT candidate for Te Aratū in West Auckland, and I also have the privilege of being number 5 on the party list, and I'm the spokesman for the environment, for energy and resources. Tonight we're going to hear from David Seymour, and I also want to introduce you to our candidate Jack, who lives in Palmerston North and is a student here. So before we kick off, I just want to tell you a little bit about why I'm a candidate for ACT and my journey. So I'm a civil and environmental engineer. I've worked for about 24 years in that industry, about 10, 12 years in the landfill, waste operations and land remediation part of environmental engineering, and about 10 years on infrastructure and construction projects. During that time, I've worked mainly for the private sector, but more recently, I spent 3 years working at Auckland Council. And it was that experience, combined with the experiences I'd had in the private sector, that showed me that really, if we're going to achieve some of the environmental and the economic outcomes that are so important to our society and to New Zealand and its future prosperity, then we actually need to rely on more innovation, not more regulation. And I'll give you an example. Back in 2000, when I was a bit of a wild-eyed young engineer, I went to the annual Waste Industry Conference and I saw a minister, a Labour minister, announced that we would achieve zero waste by 2040. And I know you're probably hearing about zero carbon and zero this and that right now. So I've heard those kind of activist-based pronouncements before. In 2000, zero waste 2040 seemed like achievable. It was a long way away. But since then, over 20 years, despite all of the recycling, and Kiwis are pretty good at that. We even wash our bean cans, some of the really, really keen ones. We have actually increased the amount of waste we're dumping in landfills from 2.5 million tonnes a year 20 years ago. It's now 3.5 million tonnes a year. And it doesn't have to be that way. But the reason that landfills are our only option is because the government says that's what we must do. In 2005, that same minister, under that same previous Labour government, passed an amendment to the RMA that bans waste to energy and clean incineration technology. Now, that probably wasn't their intention, but that's what they did. So at the same time in Europe, the EU declared they would actually have zero waste to landfill, and they would achieve that by 2020. Now, there's a stretch target for you. But they did that by enabling clean incineration technology and waste to energy. And they've largely achieved it. Their goal is no more than 5% of their residual waste to landfill. And they're getting pretty close. But they haven't given up recycling. You can't imagine that the Germans would want to give up recycling. They regard themselves as very clean and green. And the Danes are quite happy to have a high temperature incinerator in downtown Copenhagen. Clearly, another country very similar to New Zealand in terms of its environmental aspirations and heavily reliant on dairy. Now, those are the kind of examples that New Zealand should aspire to, which are if you allow industry and business and the communities they operate in to agree on what's the best technical solution for some of our environmental and other problems, then they will solve them. It's quite a different approach from a pronouncement from Wellington as to what you're allowed to do, the technology you won't be allowed to use. It's highly unlikely that a Wellington bureaucrat would be able to solve a problem like waste to landfill. So tonight we're going to hear about some of ACT's other ideas about how to solve some of our most difficult problems, the health crisis that is currently causing our country to go into lockdown after lockdown, disrupting business and disrupting events and our lives. And you're going to hear a bit more about not just the solutions, but what ACT hopes to achieve in this election and going forward. So I'd like now to welcome David Seymour, and I'd also like to welcome our Facebook audience who are watching us from all around New Zealand. Good evening and welcome to Palmerston North. David Seymour.
Hey, well, look, thanks, Simon, and thanks, Palmy. It's nice to be back. I was born in this city in 1983, which, as everyone knows, was 3 years after Manawatu last won the national championship. 5 years after the terrible injustice of losing the Shield to North Auckland, which, of course, are things that are etched in our memory. Supporting the Turbos can be sometimes a labour of love and some great patience. But I know, like you, I still do it because it's the right thing to do. The All Blacks, on the other hand, I actually stopped watching when that idiot John Mitchell dumped Christian Cullen, which was probably easily the worst decision in the history of rugby coaching and selection. But it is nice to be in the place where you started. So I want to thank everyone for being part of this. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Jack is our candidate here in Palmy. Simon is standing for Parliament, and on current polling, he's going to be an MP. And those people in Parliament, they're going to get you think you've heard something tonight, they're going to get some very technical speeches in that house, I can tell you. But it's going to improve the standard of debate about environmental policy no end. Our team, Guy, our videographer, travelling with us, you know, these people, for the most part, are not being paid. Elections are an incredible thing in New Zealand. There's no government funding for political parties. You know, we raise every dollar. No one's forced to volunteer. No one's forced to, come to a party meeting like this. No one's forced to give donations to political parties, although that is a very good idea, which I'll come to. We have elections because we love democracy and because people give up their time to work through our challenges. And I think it's never been more important than now that we're prepared to do it. So thank you for coming and sitting in this weird formation to be part of our election. I'm here in part to tell you a bit about where ACT is going and what we want to do if we get a bigger influence in the next Parliament and hopefully a part of the next government. But I'm also here to hear from you, because the way this whole thing works of representative democracy is that people get sent to Parliament to speak on others' behalf. And that's why it's so important that you do the listening and hearing bit as well as the talking bit. You know, the stereotype of politicians is a person with a mouth so big they can fit in 2 gobstoppers because they're talking. But it's also true that politicians are people, I promise. And actually, we also have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and there's a reason for the ratio. So I'm just going to give you a few thoughts and then open it up. And we're going to have a good old-fashioned town hall meeting to discuss the future of our country as it works its way through probably the most uncertain period that we've faced for a long time. And there are really 3. I think there's 3 things that any government that gets elected is going to have to deal with. 3 big issues, and I'm going to tell you where ACT's coming from on them. One is that we've got to get better at the public health response. And I would start by aiming for aspiration instead of feeding the fear. Because the way that this government approaches the pandemic is constantly telling people to be grateful and reminding them that they should be fearful. And you can see it in the places they compare ourselves with. When we do a comparison with Australia, they say, aren't you lucky that you're not Victoria? Be grateful. Now, I'm not a geographer. In fact, I'm a recovering electrical engineer. Engineering, by the way, is a degree that means that you're much more likely to get a job than a girlfriend. But And if you think politics improves matters, well, let's just say I got a job. But you know, the problem is I've completely forgotten where we're going with that now. Let me just regather some thoughts. You know, I'm not a geographer, but I know that Australia has 6 other states, and they're all doing pretty well. So why do we always get told about the one that's doing the worst and told to be grateful for that? We've got to start aiming higher. It's the same with countries. Aren't you lucky you're not Sweden? You know? Actually, I think we should be looking at Taiwan, because they had 12 times fewer deaths per head of population than we did. And we never see our Prime Minister get out and say, actually, I accept we haven't got everything right. We're looking at some other options to do better. It's always, we've done great, be grateful, we went hard, we went early, we've got the gold standard. And yet it doesn't quite square with one outbreak leading to a 6-week nationwide restriction for the whole country because of one outbreak in one city. Just doesn't add up. Either the restrictions aren't necessary or the gold standard's a fool's gold standard and we didn't go hard and we didn't go early, and that's why we're here now. So I would say that we got to improve our public health response, and I would send the 10 smartest people I could find over to Taipei, tell them, write down everything they do, come back here and we're going to copy it. Because if they can have only 7 deaths with no lockdown, despite living on top of each other and being 100 k's off the coast of China, then I think a spread out country of pretty obedient people. People say the Taiwanese are obedient, by the way. You know, their students actually stormed their parliament and took it over a few years ago. If New Zealand students did a protest, security would say, could you stand over there, please? Yes, okay. No. You know, New Zealanders would say, oh, could you please go home for 5 weeks? Here, put a teddy bear in your window? Sure, sweet as, see you. See you, you know. I mean, it's, you know, I think with a pliant group of people, then actually we could do better than Taiwan and achieve elimination without the need for costly lockdowns. And then we could start reconnecting with the rest of the world, which is absolutely essential. You know, I know there's a few sheep in the Manawatu. As it turns out, shearing is a globalized industry. Gangs of shearers go between the UK, Australia, and here. Now, there's 2 options. Either you could get a whole lot of people off the dole queue and teach them how to shear really quickly, which would probably be a bit unfair on the sheep. Or you actually do what we've always done, which is had a global labour market. We've got to start being creative about how we can get people in. And why shouldn't you be able to isolate a group of people on a farm? It's in the middle of nowhere. Follow the rules. If you break the rules, you get punished severely. But this is the kind of thinking that we're going to need. It's going to have to be much more open and expansive and aspirational and less based on fear. Our full policy on this, by the way, is on our website. We've called it a wellbeing approach to COVID-19 because it's about balancing all of the costs. You know, the mental health effects on small business people, huge. Not knowing if they're going to be able to open and trade next week. It's for people that have missed out. You know, due to the first lockdown, 400 women don't know they have breast cancer. There's other types of healthcare being missed. It's about the fact that a lockdown costs $1 billion every 2 weeks. That happens to be the Farm Act budget, which is what we spend on all taxpayer-funded drugs in New Zealand. So, you know, our wellbeing approach balances all of those costs and says we've got to be like Taiwan and achieve elimination without lockdowns and without indefinitely isolating ourselves from the world. But the second thing we're going to have to do is have an honest conversation about the debt. And again, just as we have our wellbeing approach on our website, we also have a website called Debt Destroyer. And you can actually go on and play with the numbers, try to balance the budget and see what New Zealand as a country is now up against, thanks to 140 billion of borrowing. And we owe it to our kids to do this. Not to do it, to ignore this problem, I think, is fiscal child abuse. And let me tell you, well, some of you may know, I had a brief, not brief enough career as a celebrity dancer. In fact, I can guarantee any public meeting I go to, there's at least one person who only came for that reason. As a result, I have the third biggest following on Instagram of any parliamentarian. The only problem is that the average follower age of the average, or the average, my followers' average age is 14, and the voting age is 18. So you can see my problem. But some people say I'll never be Prime Minister. Wait till 2026, and they're going to come through. It's going to be great. Now, what's interesting is these kids didn't follow me for politics. They followed me for dancing because they thought I was a funny guy. And then they ignored me for a couple of years. During the lockdown, they started messaging me saying, who is the government borrowing this money from and who has to pay it back? These kids aren't political, but they're not stupid either. They're intuitive. And I think we owe it to kids currently at intermediate who don't have any control and not much knowledge over the decisions being made right now, but they will end up paying for it. The Treasury says by the end of this decade, we'll be spending more on interest than on education. Just think about that for a moment. And I know there's people who say, don't worry, money's free. The interest rates are going to be negative. Pretty soon people will be paying you to borrow money. Well, maybe, but any student of history knows that in the long run, debt is a form of oppression, and it's never a good idea to indebt yourself. The house of cards has to come down. So our debt destroyer asks questions like, here's something that might not make me popular with some of the younger people here. We spend $500 million a year giving money to the fees-free program. So if you're 18 years old and you are at university in New Zealand, you are one of the luckiest humans that has ever existed. That's true. You think about it. Most people, had war and pestilence and famines and got beaten up and, lived in times that were sexist and homophobic. And, people basically were nasty to each other for most of history. If you're an 18-year-old New Zealander today, it's never been better. And you live in one of the greatest countries on earth, the best times in history. And if you're at university in particular, but if you're in tertiary education, then you are enormously fortunate. You probably went to a decile 7, 8, 9, 10 high school. Is that the group of people that the Labour Party was founded by working people to help? Because at the moment, they get $500 million a year from all taxpayers. And if it helps more people or kids from poorer households go to a tertiary education, I'd be all for it. Because, I think it's important that people who aren't born well off have an opportunity to make a difference in their lives. Only problem is, after they introduced the policy, actually slightly more rich kids went to uni. It's morally and economically unjustifiable. Should we keep borrowing $500 million a year, $5 billion over the next decade to keep doing that? I don't think we should. We've got to start chipping away at this debt. And if you play with the debt destroyer, you can see a whole lot of other examples. Another one, increasing benefits during the lockdown. You've got to be kidding, right? So the one group of people who weren't affected by the lockdown were people on benefits. Well, you just had to keep staying home. A whole lot of other people lost their jobs, and got taxed on their redundancy money, and had hugely uncertain futures, didn't get any kind of pay rise. Was that all we're talking about is returning benefit levels to the level they're at for the first 2 years of the Labour government? I mean, how harsh is that? Not very. But it would save another $500 million a year, or $5 billion, $6 billion over the next decade. I think that's the kind of change that we're going to have to make to balance our budget. So the second thing, I don't care who wins this election, well, I do, but whoever it is going to have to get honest about the debt. But finally, just to hopefully cheer people up a little bit, I think this could be a huge opportunity for New Zealand, because for as long as we've been a country, our greatest strength and our greatest weakness has been that we're in the middle of nowhere. And, it defines us. The one thing that every New Zealander has in common, and we only have one thing in common, is that either you or your ancestors traveled further for a better tomorrow than anyone else on the planet. And I know politicians talk a lot of crap, but you can look on the map and verify for this for yourself. You say, look, there's New Zealand. We really are further away. Or as Billy Connolly said, we're closer to the moon than we are to fucking Melbourne. It's interesting. There's something about that entrepreneurial spirit to travel that far to give your kids a better tomorrow. The only people that went close are the Australians, and they didn't come quite as far, and they didn't come quite as voluntarily either. So, that's us. We're the entrepreneurs of the world. We're the people that travel farther to make things better. And I think that actually this could be our time, because for as long as we've been around, that isolation's also had its downsides. Who knows that great Split Enz song, 6 months in a leaky boat? Hopefully some people. Aotearoa, rugged individual, bottom of the world, tyranny of distance, 6 months in a leaky boat. And we've been far from investors, far from potential employers, far from customers, far from jobs, far from everything, really. But this pandemic changes the whole situation changes the equation for New Zealand. All of a sudden, as an island nation on a pandemic planet, we have choices that continental countries don't have. If we manage the virus with good public health, and if we manage the debt with some honesty, then we have the opportunity for great stuff to happen. But first of all, the government has to stop doing stupid stuff. I've just been in Taranaki today. The way that they regulate the oil and gas is just completely insane. They got some of the cleanest gas in the world, light, sweet, crude oil. And they want to shut it down. So why? So we can burn Indonesian coal. Completely insane. Shooting ourselves in the foot. And then there's the farmers. Now, I know there's a few farmers around here, because the greatest days were when Manawatu had farmers for Fords and pretty boy varsity backs, Now, you look at the farmers in this country. They're the only people in the whole country whose livelihood depends on the land that they own. They actually, if they don't look after the land, then it's not going to be productive and they're going to be poor. So when farmers look after their land, do they do thousands of kilometres of riparian planting and fencing? Of course they do. Do they budget carefully on their nutrients? Because if they just let it fall into the river, they lose money? Of course they do. Do they get any credit for the way that they look after their local environment? Not on your life. They just get demonised by the Green Party and regulated by Labor. And I think it's time that the newfound gratitude to farmers that came out of COVID translates into policy. But unfortunately, for too long, just like oil and gas, we just punish them. And this is actually a regulatory disease. You look at people in the firearm community. I was locked down at the University of Canterbury when that tragedy happened, and man, I can tell you, it's the one time that I've been really scared. It doesn't even come close to the tragedy that some people suffer, but I have a sense of how horrible it was. And that's why I am so angry at the government's response, which didn't solve any of the problems of how did that lunatic manage to get those guns and that ammo with no one asking any questions. Not only that, but they've gone and persecuted a group of people who are just as horrified as everyone else in New Zealand, done nothing wrong, and collectively punished them. Actually divided the community, the Prime Minister of Inclusion and Kindness. That's just completely nuts. And they've made it less likely that the next terrorist will be reported, because trust in the police amongst licensed firearm owners is an all-time low. This is the quality of lawmaking that we're getting. And actually, we don't actually just have to stop doing stupid things that whack people. We need to start doing intelligent things. I look at the Resource Management Act. We need to replace it so that people can develop their own property. At the moment, you have to ask so many people permission to develop your own property. It's amazing anyone does anything. If Auckland Council can't even get water into a city of 1.5 million people, what hope do the next generation have of building themselves homes? We need to get real about property rights and the ability to develop and use your own land with new resource management law. And then we look at foreign investment. Now I know some people don't like foreigners. That's okay. I like foreigners. I think they're good people mostly. But if you don't like foreigners, then foreign investment is for you. You see, immigration is where foreigners come and live next door. Foreign investment is where they stay in their home country and just send you cash. So you should love it. And if you don't like foreigners, you should love it. And if you do like foreigners, you should love it as well, either way. But we make New Zealand one of the hardest places to invest in. The hoops they have to jump through. Even companies that you might think were New Zealand companies. Take Montana, the wine company, owned by Lion, owned by the Japanese. So they're a foreign company, actually. If they want to buy a new vineyard, they've got to jump through all the hoops. You wonder why people don't want to do business here and invest and create more interesting jobs. Well, it's because we make it actively hostile to people that want to come here. And I think there's some countries around the world that maybe we don't want to do as much business with as we have been, because they don't share all of our values the way we hoped they would when we signed a free trade agreement with them. But actually, we need to start strengthening our connections with democratic countries. And that says, if you're a democratic OECD country, then we actually want to fast track you to invest and build more business connections with other democracies around the world. I think it's actually essential economically and geopolitically that we do that. So these are some of the opportunities we have to use your land, to stop beating up on industries, to get investment, to actually see New Zealand as the place that people want to come and invest and work and do great stuff over what may be several years of living on a pandemic planet, because this thing may come around year after year in different strains. Who knows? If one guy eating a bat can cause this, who knows what might happen next? There's a great gag. Anyone who says one man can't change the world never ate a bat. But, there'll be more like this. There will be. And we need to be prepared for it. But our island status could become our greatest strength if only we're prepared to use it. Anyway, I'm a great follower of Confucius, and Confucius once said a short speech by a politician is a great mercy for an audience. And so I will stop there and open it up and see what it is that is on the minds of people in Palmy. I may have addressed some of your thoughts. I may be completely contrary to you on some issues. There may be things on your mind that I haven't gone near. But that's the point of the second half of this talk, is to have that discussion. So thank you very much, and please hear what you've got to say. Ma'am.